Imagine Europe in the 11th century. Crowds of pilgrims returned from the Holy Land with stories of miracles and suffering. But the moment came when Pope Urban II uttered the words that would change the entire continent, Deus vult. God wills it. Thus began the First Crusade. Without discipline, without a unified command, but with fanatical faith. And, a miracle, in 1099, the Crusaders took Jerusalem. In the east of Europe, new states appeared, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader fortresses. But holding them was far more difficult than conquering them. Half a century passed. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, was meant to strengthen these lands. 2 European kings set out on the campaign, but it all ended in failure. Damascus held, the armies returned humiliated, and the eastern rulers tasted victory. It was then that a new star arose, Sultan Saladin. He unites Egypt and Syria, gathers tens of thousands of warriors, and in 1187, delivers a blow that shakes the world. On the hills near Hattin, the Crusader army was annihilated, and soon Jerusalem fell as well. Europe shuddered. The chronicles of that time wrote, the world trembled, and the hearts of men went numb. For Christians, this was not just a military defeat, it was an insult to the faith itself. And so, 3 of the greatest rulers of the West prepare for a campaign. Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II Augustus, and Richard the Lionheart. Thus begins the story we will tell today, the story of the Third Crusade, the most dramatic clash between East and West. Imagine the 12th century. Europe is living its usual life, the ringing of bells, the noise of markets, knights in tournaments. And suddenly, the bells begin to sound different. Their toll is heavy, anxious, as if the entire continent has gasped from an unexpected blow. The news that came from the east was stunning, Jerusalem had fallen. The city, which for centuries was considered the heart of the faith, the key to the heavens, was in foreign hands. For Europe, this was not just an event, it was a sign. A signal that the familiar world could collapse. In Rome, Pope Gregory VIII issues the bull, Audita Tremendi, having heard the terrible news. This address was not a dry text, it was a cry. A cry addressed to everyone. If Jerusalem is lost, then what is next? And it was then that something unexpected happened. It was not just knights who answered the call, not just pilgrims. Kings rose. Frederick Barbarossa, the legend of Germany, an emperor whose name made his neighbors tremble. Philip II Augustus, a young French king, clever, ambitious, and ready to make a name for himself. And Richard the Lionheart, the new English monarch, who was already spoken of as a hero of chivalric songs. For the first time in the history of the Crusades, the greatest monarchs of Europe decided to march together. And that changed everything. Now, this was not a spontaneous movement of pilgrims, not a desperate attempt like before. This was a campaign backed by armies, gold, and thrones. The ringing of the bells had not yet faded when the first of the kings raised his banners. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, set out on his journey. He was over 60, but in the eyes of his contemporaries, he seemed unbendable. A legend of Germany, a man under whom an entire empire from the Baltic to the Alps was held in unity. His nickname, Barbarossa, Red Beard, became a symbol of power, wisdom, and determination. Tens of thousands of warriors set out on the campaign. These were not spontaneous crowds like before. Barbarossa's army resembled a living machine. Knights in gleaming armor. Foot soldiers accustomed to discipline. Supply wagons with provisions and weapons. Chroniclers wrote that when this force marched along the roads of Europe, the earth trembled from their steps. In the cities they passed through, residents came out into the streets to see the unprecedented sight, a stream of people stretching beyond the horizon. Their road lay through the Balkans. There, where bandits waited in mountain gorges and fortresses stood on passes, Barbarossa's army marched forward without losing a step. Further on, Asia Minor, the lands of the Seljuks. Here, the emperor showed that an experienced commander could turn any situation around. Several clashes ended in victories. And it seemed nothing could stop the advance to the Holy Land. Summer of 1190. Barbarossa's army reached the Salef River. The current was turbulent and cold, the water forcefully carrying stones and logs, as if nature itself had decided to stand in their way. Frederick Barbarossa, as always, went first. The emperor was over 60, but he still set an example for his army. His horse entered the water, the foam churned, and the current struck with increasing force. On the other bank, hills were already visible, like a promise of the goal. But the river did not yield. In an instant, the current proved stronger. The news of the emperor's death swept through the camp, throwing the soldiers into disarray. In a single moment, the army lost not only its leader but also its heart. The one who was considered the pillar of the entire campaign was gone. And the disciplined, formidable force suddenly began to fall apart. Some turned back, considering the journey over. Others dispersed in small detachments, getting lost on the roads of Asia Minor. Only a small part, led by devoted commanders, managed to continue the journey and reach Acre, the city where the greatest events of the crusade would soon unfold. The Salef became a symbol, for some, the shattering of hopes, for others, a reminder that the elements are stronger than man. Thus, the first crown of the Third Crusade was lost. Barbarossa, the greatest emperor of Europe, did not reach the Holy Land. His army disintegrated, and Europe froze for a moment in confusion. But history did not stop. In the West, sails were already being raised. Two other monarchs, the French King Philip II Augustus and the English King Richard the Lionheart, were preparing to set sail. And if Barbarossa was the embodiment of a wise and steadfast elder, these two represented a new generation. Philip, practical and cold, a thinker and strategist, skilled at profiting from every situation. Richard, his complete opposite. A warrior romantic, a legend of chivalric songs, a king about whom ballads were composed even during his lifetime. Their alliance was necessary, but from the very beginning, it concealed a spark of rivalry. And soon this rivalry would manifest itself on the way to the east. Philip and Richard set out by sea. The French king remained reserved and cautious, thinking of politics and profit. But Richard immediately showed his character and entered into battle on Cyprus with its ruler, Isaac Komnenos. Spring of 1191. The fleet of Richard the Lionheart was racing toward the Holy Land when a green island appeared on the horizon, Cyprus. At first glance, a paradise in the sea, vineyards stretching to the hills, white cities with churches and Byzantine fortresses, harbors where merchants from east and west exchanged goods. But this paradise was ruled by a man whose name would become fateful in the chronicles, Isaac Komnenos. His power was built on pride and arrogance, and his encounter with the English king proved to be momentous. When Richard's ships were caught in a storm, some vessels were washed ashore on Cyprus. Both men and property ended up there. As well as Richard's fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre. But the ruler of Cyprus offered no help. On the contrary, he acted as if the island were a trap and strangers were unwelcome. For Richard, this was a challenge. The king, accustomed to deciding his own fate, could not tolerate humiliation. The chronicles tell that the English monarch acted swiftly. His ships entered the harbor, his men landed on the shore. The island, which for centuries had been a crossroads of cultures, now became the arena for the determination of one king. Richard subjugated Cyprus. But he did not destroy it, did not turn it into a desert. On the contrary, he made it the key to the future campaign. The island became a supply base, provisions were gathered here, ships with food and soldiers came here. Cyprus was transformed into the logistical heart of the Crusaders, and Richard into a figure even greater than before. He proved himself not only a hero of ballads but also a master of strategy. Thus, Cyprus became a symbol of a new type of crusade. If Barbarossa perished without reaching the Holy Land, Richard showed that success was possible not only through the strength of the sword but also through the ability to seize opportunities. It was from here, from this crossroads island, that the path to the next ordeal began. Richard's ships glided over the waves toward the shores of the Holy Land, to where a grueling siege had already been dragging on for 2 years. The city that became the world's nexus. Acre, not just a city. It was the main port of the East, a crossroads of routes, a gateway through which supplies and troops passed. Whoever controlled Acre held the fate of the entire coast in their hands. Just recently, this city had belonged to the Crusaders. Since 1104, Acre had been part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the wealthiest port, through which trade with the east and west flowed. European merchants built houses, markets, and piers here, and the city was considered one of the liveliest in Palestine. But in 1187, after the Battle of Hattin, Saladin took control of Acre. From that moment, it became the main base for Muslim forces on the coast. For the East, it was a bastion, for Europe, a symbol of loss and the number one objective. The siege began in 1189. For 2 long years, the armies of Europe and Saladin's garrison stood against each other. Outside, a huge Crusader camp grew, a whole city of tents, fortifications, and roads. Inside, Acre held on, as if the walls themselves were imbued with the determination of its defenders. Time dragged on, but the stalemate was not broken. Neither sorties nor assaults brought success. It seemed the forces were frozen, waiting for a decisive blow. In the spring of 1191, the fleet of Richard the Lionheart approached the walls of Acre. His arrival became the turning point. The King of England acted swiftly. He intensified the pressure, reorganized the troops, and inspired the knights with his personal example. In the summer of 1191, the Allied forces brought the siege to an end. 2 armies, French and English, united in a final assault. After 2 years of struggle, Acre capitulated. For Europe, this was the first real victory of the Third Crusade. But the joy was short-lived. As soon as the sounds of victory faded, a dispute erupted: who would get the spoils, whose banners would fly over the walls, who would be first in glory. Philip and Richard, allies just recently, became rivals. The French king soon returned home, leaving the crusade behind. From that moment on, the burden of the struggle fell on one man. Only Richard the Lionheart remained in the east. Saladin awaited him. And what was beginning was not just a war of armies, but a confrontation of 2 legends. After the fall of Acre, Saladin understood, he could not let Richard consolidate his position. Otherwise, the campaign would turn into a prolonged offensive, threatening his entire state. Therefore, while the English army was moving along the coast toward Jaffa, Saladin decided to strike. The site was the town of Arsuf, a point on the map where the sea, forest, and plain converged into one narrow passage. Richard the Lionheart arranged his army as experience and discipline had taught. At the front, English archers, whose arrows could weaken the enemy's charge. In the center, heavy infantry, like a stone wall. On the flanks, knights, holding their warhorses in check, ready to charge forward at any moment. His formation resembled a mobile fortress, advancing step by step. Saladin used a different tactic. His light cavalry and archers acted in waves, swift charges, showers of arrows, sudden strikes, and equally rapid retreats. His strength was in mobility and constant pressure. The day was hot, dust rose like a fog, and the sounds of horns and drums merged into a roar that made the ground tremble. The soldiers awaited the order, the tension growing with each minute. But Richard was in no hurry. He restrained the knights, maintained the formation, until the decisive moment arrived. The Crusader formation moved forward like a moving fortress. The day dragged on agonizingly, waves of arrows fell from the sky, the light cavalry of the east circled and harassed, striking and then pulling away. The soldiers in the ranks gripped their spears, the knights reined in their horses, which strained to charge forward. The tension became almost unbearable. And then, a moment of silence. Richard raised his hand. The signal sounded, short, but long awaited. The flanks came to life. The knights, held back for hours, finally broke loose like a coiled spring. The horses were no longer restrained, the heavy animals surged forward, the ground trembling under their hooves. The steel of lances and the gleam of shields turned the formation into a glittering wave. It struck the enemy ranks as if the earth itself had collapsed upon them. The light cavalry, accustomed to swift charges and retreats, could not withstand it. Where a moment before the sleek ranks of the eastern horsemen had circled, chaos now reigned. The clash was not just a battle, it was a clash of 2 tactics, 2 worlds. Mobility gave way to discipline, speed to endurance. And in that moment, it became clear, the Battle of Arsuf was decided. The waves of attacks that had crashed down all day long disintegrated. Saladin retreated, and Richard's name was firmly established as that of a commander who knew how to wait and win. Thus Arsuf became a symbol of Richard's military genius. He showed that the ability to master time and endurance could be stronger than any numbers or maneuvers. The Battle of Arsuf was a resounding triumph for Richard. Europe spoke of him as an invincible Night King. And now, after months of battles, the Crusader army approached its great goal. On the horizon, in the desert haze, the walls of Jerusalem appeared. The domes of the temples glistened under the sun, like precious stones on an open palm. For many soldiers, this was the moment for which they had marched thousands of miles, the city that preachers sang of, for which generations had given their strength. But Richard was silent. He looked at the city and understood what his knights did not want to hear. Yes, Jerusalem could be besieged. Yes, the walls could be taken. But to hold it was impossible. Saladin was near, his forces gathering around like a ring. Heat and disease were depleting the men faster than enemy blows. Supplies were dwindling. Each new day of the campaign cost more than the last. In Richard's camp, the knights grumbled, they were waiting for the order to march on Jerusalem. They believed their journey could not end any other way than at the walls of the holy city. But Richard, listening to reports from scouts and advisors, understood, holding Jerusalem while surrounded by Saladin's troops was impossible. On the other hand, Saladin also knew the value of time. He could continue to resist, but new battles threatened to exhaust his empire. His men said that the Sultan respected Richard's resilience and skill, and for this reason, he sought peace rather than an all-out clash. For the warrior romantic, as Europe knew him, this was the most difficult step. But for the commander, it was the only correct path. Richard refuses the siege. Instead of walls and swords, he chooses words and reason. Negotiations begin with Saladin, between two worlds, two symbols, weary of the endless tension. They never met face to face. But chroniclers write that an invisible bridge of respect existed between them. Each knew, on the other side stood not just an enemy, but an equal, a man whose name would live on for centuries. Words were conveyed through envoys. And every turn of phrase sounded like a verdict, for behind it stood not only armies but the hopes of thousands of people. Chroniclers preserved fragments of words and hints. They wrote that Saladin offered terms that had previously seemed unthinkable, open roads for pilgrims, the ability for Christians to freely enter Jerusalem. Contemporaries claimed that Richard accepted this decision reluctantly. He understood, his knights craved triumph, but the true duty of a commander was not to chase glory, but to preserve the future. Thus, a truce was concluded in 1192, Jerusalem remained under Saladin's rule, but it became accessible to Christians. Europe did not get the city, but it gained the right to faith. The chronicles said that this was neither a victory nor a defeat, but a rare moment when two great leaders managed to stop the storm. And that is why, in the memory of posterity, the names of Richard and Saladin always sound together, as a symbol of a confrontation in which there was a place for both strength and wisdom. The Third Crusade entered the chronicles not as another military adventure, but as an epic. Never before had Europe seen three of the greatest monarchs of its time rise together. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Philip II Augustus of France, and King Richard the Lionheart of England. Their campaign was meant to reclaim Jerusalem and end in glory. But history decided otherwise. Yes, Richard won at Arsuf, crushing Saladin's army. Yes, he took Acre, the key port of the east. Yes, his name became a legend, that Night King, the ideal warrior. But Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. He saw the city but did not enter it. And this became the greatest drama of the crusade. The goal was near, but remained unattainable. And yet, the campaign did not end in defeat. In 1192, a truce was concluded that went down in history. Jerusalem remained under the rule of Saladin, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed the right to visit the holy sites, including the Holy Sepulchre. This was a compromise, rare for the 12th century. Two civilizations found a point of contact. And although the knights in the camps grumbled, although many in Europe considered the result incomplete, this peace saved lives and left a chance for the future. The Third Crusade did not return Jerusalem, but it changed Europe and the East. Europe gained the image of the knight hero, which inspired generations. The East preserved its defender, whose name became a symbol of justice. And the world learned that even in a brutal age, agreements based not only on force but also on reason are possible. Thus ended the Crusade of Kings. It did not achieve its main goal, but it left behind not a void, but a lesson. A lesson that history is rarely black and white. That even a defeat can contain elements of victory. That sometimes the greatest battles take place not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who make the decisions. And that is why, centuries later, we remember the Third Crusade not only as a war for Jerusalem, but as a drama of three crowns and a dialogue between two worlds, the West and the East.